It is terrifyingly easy to fabricate a persona of power. Any actor can mimic confidence, simulate kindness, or feign the discipline required to build an empire for a short season. Yet the mask always slips. There are microscopic tells, subconscious leakages of character that expose the reality beneath the costume. Niccolò Machiavelli was a master at decoding these signals. Navigating the treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy, a viper's nest of traitors, opportunists, and frauds, he did not have the luxury of giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. Guessing wrong meant death. He required absolute certainty. Through his survival, he realized a fundamental truth: fragility does not announce itself with a scream. It seeps out through the cracks in a man's armor. While the truly powerful maintain a stoic, unnerving silence, the weak inadvertently betray themselves through behavioral patterns they are completely blind to. Once you learn to recognize these distinct signatures in your rivals, your business partners, or even within your own reflection, you secure a devastating psychological advantage. Machiavelli wielded this insight like a hidden blade. It gave him the foresight to identify a man's breaking point long before that man became a liability. These are not obvious flaws. To the untrained eye, these behaviors look normal, perhaps even polite. But the Florentine strategist saw them differently. He analyzed human nature with the cold precision of a predator stalking prey. In his studies, he isolated 3 specific habits that instantly disqualify a man from the ranks of the strong. Let us dissect the first, which is often the most difficult to detect: the curse of over-explanation. Here is the rule. The servile mind rationalizes. The sovereign mind decides. When you encounter a man who feels compelled to defend every choice, write paragraphs justifying his actions, or beg for understanding, you are not looking at honesty. You're looking at deep-seated insecurity. Machiavelli witnessed this dynamic constantly in the royal courts. A prince secure in his dominion spoke in short, final sentences. But the impostors, the nervous ministers, and climbing merchants filled the air with endless chatter. The weak man verbally vomits logic because he needs you to sign off on his reality. He cannot trust his own judgment until he sees you nodding in agreement. This is the hallmark of a psyche that relies entirely on external validation. He does not seek respect. He seeks to be liked, to be safe, to be included. He craves acceptance above competence. To a sharp observer like Machiavelli, this was transparent. It is the behavior of a man begging the world for permission to occupy space. Do not mistake this for communication. Over-justification is a defensive shield against fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of social rejection, and ultimately, a terror of wielding authority. The brutal reality is that any man who requires a consensus before he takes a step can never be entrusted with true command. Power by its nature is often a solitary burden. Leadership demands conviction. It requires the stomach to execute a vision without offering a presentation on why it was necessary to every critic in the room. So observe carefully. The next time a colleague circles back to explain his point for the 3rd time, trying to frame his desire as morally superior or logical, do not be fooled. You are witnessing an internal collapse in real time. However, that is merely the first red flag. The second indicator is colder and significantly more treacherous, weaponized agreeableness. This is the most toxic form of fragility because it disguises itself as virtue. Machiavelli understood that the most unreliable men were rarely the ones scowling in the corner. The true threats often appeared helpful, accommodating, and perpetually smiling. But this is not genuine benevolence. It is submission masquerading as morality. Understand the distinction. A high-value man offers kindness from a place of abundance and choice. He's kind because he chooses to be, but never at the expense of his dignity. The weak man is nice because he has no other defense. He agrees with you to diffuse potential conflict. He offers compliments to purchase your favor. He remains silent when his values are trampled. He apologizes not to repair a wrong, but to preemptively disarm your anger. And here is the danger when this strategy fails to get him the praise he feels he is owed. The mask rots. The nice guy inevitably transforms into the most bitter, sarcastic, and passive-aggressive enemy you will ever face. Why? Because his niceness was a transaction. It was a covert contract designed to evade rejection. When the world does not pay him back for his submission, his repressed resentment explodes. Machiavelli analyzed this duplicity in public leaders. He famously noted that a ruler must possess the capacity to be ruthless when necessary. Restraint implies you have the power to destroy, but choose peace. Weaponized niceness means you are harmless and terrified. It is the posture of a man who does not know how to occupy his own frame. He shrinks himself, praying that by being small, the world will not crush him. When you identify this compulsive need to please, this friendliness that curdles into spite under the slightest pressure, you have identified a man who must never be given leverage. Real power demands the ability to establish hard boundaries, to deliver a firm no without guilt, and to endure tension without collapsing into a nervous smile. Machiavelli would track this behavior with hawk-like intensity, because he knew such a man's loyalty is as fragile as his ego. It will shatter the moment the wind changes. Yet there remains a third behavior. This one is more desperate, more visible, and arguably the most humiliating spectacle of all. When you witness this trait, realize you're standing before a soul that fears irrelevance more than it fears death. The third fatal flaw, the one that made Machiavelli instantly categorize a man as a pawn, is display addiction. You know this archetype. The man who physically cannot exist without an audience. The individual who becomes restless and agitated the moment the spotlight shifts away from him. In our modern context of 2026, this is the man who broadcasts every minor achievement, amplifies his voice to dominate the room, and turns his life into performative art. Machiavelli saw the archaic versions of this, and the principle remains unchanged. A man obsessed with visibility is terrified of being forgotten. That anxiety is the ultimate weakness. This is not the hunger that drives a man out of poverty. This is the rot of a hollow identity. Display addiction is the opposite of confidence. It is a plea for validation. It is the panic response of a human being who lacks an internal compass or foundation. They operate under the delusion that if they are not being discussed, envied, or applauded, they cease to exist. Their self-worth evaporates the moment the audience looks away. This is precisely why Machiavelli viewed them as massive liabilities. A man addicted to attention is easily manipulated, for he will do anything, betray anyone, compromise anything just to keep eyes on him. They will lie to your face, embellish every story, and betray their closest friends without a second thought. They will expose your darkest secrets, turn on their allies, and fabricate enemies out of thin air, just as long as they have an audience watching them. This behavior stems from a deep, primal fear. In their minds, silence is not just quiet, it is a death sentence. Stillness equates to irrelevance. And in their twisted hierarchy, the absolute worst fate is to be forgotten. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He knew that a man addicted to the spectacle, a man who lives for the display, is nothing more than a puppet waiting for a master to pull his strings. If you ever want to destroy a man like that, you do not need to attack him. You simply ignore him. You starve him of the spotlight and cut off the applause he craves. You make him feel invisible. Then you watch how rapidly he shatters. Strong men train in the shadows, grow in the silence, and strike without warning. The weak man, however, cannot survive 5 minutes without being noticed. This makes him pitifully easy to predict, incredibly easy to manipulate, and absolutely impossible to trust. This is exactly why Machiavelli feared weakness far more than he feared wickedness. At least a wicked man has clear desires. He knows what he wants. The weak man wants everything at once, yet he will trade anything and anyone to get a fleeting moment of validation. When you combine these three toxic behaviors, the compulsive justifier who excuses every mistake, the fake nice appeaser who avoids all conflict, and the attention addict who needs eyes on him, you do not get a villain. You get a black hole. You get a man so hollow and devoid of substance that he will fluidly take the shape of anyone in the room stronger than him. That malleability is what Machiavelli dreaded most. It was not the loud tyrants or the cruel dictators, but the empty vessels. The danger lies in the vacuum because emptiness begs to be filled with something. And when a malicious actor gets close to that void, they fill it with chaos and destruction. But this is where Machiavelli went beyond simple observation. He did not just identify these weaknesses, he weaponized them. He transformed these behavioral flaws into tools, into predictive models, and into points of supreme leverage. He realized that the ability to spot a weak man early in the game could be the sole factor deciding between rising to power and suffering a brutal betrayal. These men do not simply break when the pressure mounts, they melt. And in the high-stakes worlds of politics, war business, and trust, you cannot afford to depend on a structure that liquefies under heat. So how do you build your defenses? How do you move through the world with the strategic mind of Machiavelli? You stop listening, and you start watching. You must stop judging people by their charming smiles, their smooth words, or their impressive job titles. Instead, you must judge them strictly by their psychological patterns. You study their behavior when the room disagrees with them, when the cameras are off, when the praise stops flowing, and when nobody gives them an incentive to be a good person. You look for the hairline fractures in their character. The strong man does not panic in the quiet. He builds, he sharpens his blade, and he plans his next move. The weak man cannot handle the silence. He performs for an empty room, he frantically explains himself, and inevitably, he crumbles. Once you can distinguish between the two, you instantly acquire a weapon that most people never even think to sharpen true discernment. This is the power to see not just the persona someone pretends to be, but the person they will become the moment life stops going their way. That is how Machiavelli selected his inner circle. That is how he avoided systemic collapse. And that is the only way you will outlast the masses who are still fooled by surface-level charisma. Because beneath the polished words and the curated public image behavior never lies. Machiavelli did not stop at simply spotting the weak. He turned their insecurity into a ladder for his own ascent. While the average man reacted to weakness with frustration or disgust, Machiavelli reacted with cold strategy. Because once you have mapped someone's emotional fault lines, once you understand the mechanics of their panic and how they think, how they desperately seek approval, you realize you do not need to argue with them. You do not need to fight them. You simply guide them. You lead them like a rope pulling a marionette from behind the curtain. He grasped a critical truth about human nature. The weak man essentially wants to be led. He just does not want to feel controlled. So Machiavelli gave them precisely what their egos demanded to keep them docile. He fed them praise when they felt ignored, offered agreement when they felt insecure, and lavished them with flattery when they needed validation. He did this not out of respect, but because he saw how easily they could be molded. And that is where his true power originated. He did not rely on brute strength alone to maintain control. He did not force anyone to obey him. He engineered a situation where the weak obeyed him of their own free will, offering them just enough emotional candy to keep them addicted to his approval. The system worked with surgical precision. He would spot the justifier, the man who felt compelled to explain away every mistake. Instead of challenging his excuses, Machiavelli would simply listen. He would nod, solemnly make eye contact, and say, "That makes perfect sense." In that instant, that man would psychologically attach himself to Machiavelli, craving more of that rare validation like a drug. He would be willing to defend him, support his agenda, and even spy for him, all because Machiavelli made him feel understood. But it was never understanding. It was pure leverage. Then he would turn his gaze to the chronic people-pleaser, the man who tried to stay nice, agreeable, and helpful at all costs. Machiavelli would give him a task, make him feel chosen, and let him feel safe, as if he were finally part of something powerful and protective. That man would never dream of betraying Machiavelli, not because of loyalty, but because betrayal would mean losing the only thing keeping his fragile identity together. And then there was the display addict, the narcissist who needed attention the way a drowning man needs oxygen. To that man, Machiavelli would offer the stage. He would let him speak in meetings and allow him to take public credit for ideas that served Machiavelli's own goals. He allowed him to wear the costume of influence and the crown of authority. While behind the scenes, Machiavelli was the one writing every line of the script. He knew that if you give a weak man the illusion of power, he will never look up to question who actually holds the leash. This is how empires are built. Not with war, not with blood, but with psychological engineering. You identify the weak links. Then you let them build your palace for you, fueled by their desperate, pathetic need to be seen approved of and included. If they ever dare to turn against you, do not engage in a messy, loud confrontation. Instead, simply withdraw the very thing they crave your attention. Let them implode in the deafening silence of your absence. Allow them to self-destruct as they scramble frantically clawing for some semblance of control or significance that they lost the moment you looked away. There is no weapon more devastating to a fragile ego than absolute indifference from the one who validated their existence. To be unseen is a fate worse than death, and this is the essence of the Machiavellian approach to managing human frailty. You do not lower yourself to argue. You do not strip them bare publicly. Instead, you turn their own nature into a tool for your use. While they perform and posture for the spotlight, you remain immovable in the shadows, observing every twitch. While they are busy hunting for fleeting applause, you're quietly accumulating leverage and tangible authority. However, Niccolò Machiavelli prescribed one final critical commandment to maintain this balance. It is arguably the most ruthless principle of them all. You must never under any circumstances allow a subordinate to delusionally think they stand on your level. The second they feel equal, they develop amnesia about who constructed their pedestal. They begin to overstep their boundaries and nurture vivid fantasies of rebellion. Therefore, you must maintain a cavernous distance between your station and theirs to prevent this arrogance from taking root. Distribute crumbs of praise sparingly, just enough to keep the engine running, but never sufficient to let them think they can drive the car alone. And should they ever attempt to challenge you, do not strike back with emotional retaliation. You simply discard and replace them without a second thought. The world is absolutely teeming with insecure individuals starving for a pat on the head. You will never run out of inventory. Supply is high for them, but you are a scarce resource. This is the core of the philosophy. It is not about crushing others with brute force, but steering them through their own base instincts. You are not managing personnel. You're pulling the strings of their deepest insecurities until they mistake their dependence for undying loyalty. You require no official rank. You need no golden crown to command. In fact, raising your voice is a sign of weakness. To dominate the fragile, you need only a profound understanding of their psychology and the discipline of absolute silence. The Italian strategist understood a fundamental truth. Masterclass manipulation is invisible. It disguises itself as camaraderie. It wears the mask of benevolent mentorship to lower their defenses. It appears simply as being there. You see, insecure men are perpetually scanning their environment, not to find objective truth, but to hunt for social cues and validation signals to orient themselves. They gravitate toward validation with the same self-destructive compulsion as moths diving into a fire. Once you grasp this mechanic, you can sculpt their every action without ever uttering a shout. This is precisely how the great strategist navigated the treacherous waters of royal courts governments and shifting alliances, achieving his ends without relying on physical might. He allowed the needy to approach him, and upon their arrival, he slipped into the perfect character for the situation, mirroring exactly what they needed to see. For the one who talked too much, he was the silent confidant. For the sycophant, he was the stoic commander. For the narcissist craving the limelight, he was the architect in the shadows. He never fought against their defects. Instead, he utilized those flaws, feeding their egos just enough to maintain the performance. The return on investment was staggering, effortless loyalty and a legion of defenders he never even had to recruit. He secured total obedience without issuing a single order. This is the critical realization you must reach if you wish to wield true, dark psychological power in the modern world. The most effective domination is that which remains unseen. It operates best when the subject is fully convinced that every move they make is their own idea. They must believe they voluntarily chose to follow you. They should feel a swell of pride in serving your vision, not because you forced them, but precisely because you never asked them to. Let us dissect the methodology further. Rule number 1. Exercise verbal economy. The more fragile the man's ego, the more desperate he is for constant verbal reassurance from you. Deny them that fix. Offer them strategic heavy silence instead. Allow the uncomfortable quiet to force them into oversharing and exposing their cards to fill the void. Let them babble until they talk themselves into feelings of guilt, undeserved loyalty, or awe. Then, when you finally choose to break your silence, ensure your words carry the weight of a rare prize. A solitary compliment, a barely perceptible nod, a fragment of wisdom, these become more valuable than gold to them. They will chase that high. They will obsess over it and analyze it for days. At this stage, they are no longer merely collaborating with you. They are laboring to feed a hunger inside themselves, a hunger that you engineered and now control. Rule number 2, embody the eye of the hurricane. Weak individuals exist in a state of constant emotional turbulence. They shatter and panic when circumstances shift or plans dissolve. A hint of criticism makes them overcorrect wildly. A moment of neglect sends them spiraling. You must be the antithesis of this. You remain structurally sound, composed, and unbothered. Operate with deliberate, quiet intention. By becoming the void that absorbs their chaos, you project immense power through contrast alone, without ever needing to boast or assert dominance. Their internal monologue shifts to, "He must possess secret knowledge. He is the anchor in this storm. I must align myself with him to survive." They project their desperate need for stability onto you because their own foundations are rotting. Once that projection is fixed, your control over them is both undetectable and absolute. Rule number 3, utilize intermittent reinforcement. This is the sophisticated Machiavellian twist that most amateur manipulators fail to grasp. You must never be consistent with your rewards. Do not become a reliable vending machine for praise or emotional support, or they will take you for granted. Cultivate an air of unpredictability. On certain days, you grant them warmth. On others, you're a ghost. Sometimes a nod. Other times, you look right through them as if they do not exist. Why employ this tactic? Because psychological uncertainty breeds addiction. If they cannot predict when the dopamine hit of your approval is coming, they remain hooked, always waiting. Consequently, they continue to dance, to guess, to analyze your every micro-expression. You evolve from being a mere leader in their mental hierarchy into something far more potent. You become a full-blown obsession. It is here in the recesses of their preoccupied minds that true dominion is established and solidified. When they develop a chemical dependency on your presence and recognition, the terror of your disapproval takes root. You no longer need to inflict punishment or raise a hand. Your withdrawal is the torture. You need not correct their errors. Your silence becomes a polished mirror reflecting their inadequacies, one from which they cannot flee. At this point, you own them completely, not through the crude tools of fear or overt threats, but through the far stronger chains of psychological dependency and desire. This is the masterful art of diagnosing fragility in others and re-engineering those individuals into stepping stones for your own ascent to power. The elegance of the strategy lies in its invisibility. They will remain oblivious, labeling their servitude as admiration or deep respect, fully convinced they walked this road willingly. But you will hold the keys to the truth. You identified the structural cracks in their psyche. You decoded their behavioral patterns and used them to build your empire. While they struggled to stay afloat in the noise of their own insecurities, you ascended quietly. Yet remember that Machiavelli feared one thing more than external coup: the betrayal of finding weakness within his own soul. Niccolo Machiavelli grasped a brutal truth that the majority of the population desperately tries to ignore. True frailty isn't merely a flaw you identify in your rivals. It is a parasite you must actively track down and exterminate within your own psyche every single morning, specifically because it disguises itself so effectively. It infiltrates your defenses through the pathetic habit of overjustification, through that burning childish need to be liked by strangers, through the addiction to external applause, and through the empty spaces in a conversation that you frantically filled when you should have remained stone silent. It manifests in the hollow apologies you offer, not out of genuine remorse, but out of sheer terror of conflict. For Machiavelli, total self-dominion wasn't a hobby. It was perpetual warfare. If you surrendered, even a single skirmish in this internal campaign society would smell the blood in the water long before you realized you were bleeding. Consequently, he engineered a rigorous protocol, a mental filter, designed to intercept fragility the instant it whispered in his subconscious. Let us dissect exactly how he executed this algorithm. First, he conducted a forensic audit of how he explained himself to others. There is a fundamental law of power. Sovereigns issue decrees. Servants offer excuses. When you possess true strength, you make decisions. When you are weak, you rationalize them. Machiavelli conditioned himself to feel a physical revulsion whenever he began to speak more than necessary, or when he found himself repeating a directive, or worse, softening his tone to appease the room. In every interaction, he posed a lethal question to his ego. Am I speaking with conviction, or am I begging to be accepted? If the scale tipped toward the latter, he cut the cord immediately. He understood that a man soliciting validation has already abdicated his throne. Secondly, he rigorously tested his reflex to agree. The average person perceives an affirmative yes as positive, but the strategist views it as a potential liability. A compliant yes can dismantle an empire. Whether it is agreeing to dodge an uncomfortable confrontation, agreeing to curry favor without leverage, or agreeing without setting terms, it is poison. He learned to insert a calculated pause before any commitment, asking himself, would I agree to this if I had zero fear of losing their goodwill? If the answer was negative, the refusal was absolute. No justifications, no softening the blow. Because the second your word loses its density, your authority evaporates even in your own mirror. Thirdly, he calibrated his relationship with silence. Fragile men are terrified of dead air. They view silence as a social failure, so they scramble to plug the gap with nervous laughter, empty compliments, and rambling explanations because the quiet forces them to face reality. Machiavelli conversely sharpened silence into a bludgeon. He practiced existing in the void amidst chaotic rooms, measuring his own pulse and comfort levels. When the tension peaked, he didn't retreat. He leaned forward into it. Why? Because mastered silence evolves into presence, and presence, when distilled, becomes terror without a single threat being uttered. Fourth, he rejected the narcotic of unnecessary exposure. The insecure man is desperate to be perceived at all times. The powerful man dictates the timeline. Machiavelli mastered the art of being a ghost, observing, while his rivals exhausted themselves chasing the limelight. He remained in the obscure shadows until every piece on the chessboard was locked in position. When he finally struck, it wasn't interpreted as an attempt at progress. It was received as a definitive arrival. He didn't generate hype through loud announcements. He generated magnetism through his calculated absence. Consequently, when he finally voiced a command or made a move, the world halted. That reaction was not a stroke of luck. It was architected, drilled, and refined. He systematically cauterized every soft spot in his character before his enemies could leverage them. Machiavelli wasn't merely playing offense. He was sealing the breaches that others would eventually try to exploit. This is the precise failure of the modern ambitious man. He attempts to project power while leaving his back gate unlocked. They posture, but they never conduct the autopsy of their own motives. Ask yourself, am I hunting for compliments? Am I paralyzed by the thought of rejection? Do I speak to influence reality, or simply to hear my own voice affirmed? Do I require the affection of the tribe before I dare to lead it? Do I offer an explanation when a cold stare would have been more effective? These inquiries do more than expose fragility. They map out the exact boundaries of your potential. Once you identify these fractures, you face a binary choice. You can nurture them and remain stagnant, or you can slaughter them and evolve into a force the world is compelled to reckon with. In the grand mechanics of power, especially as we look toward 2026, you are not penalized for being ruthless. You're penalized for being predictable, volatile, and fragile. You must excise these traits neuron by neuron, choice by choice, until the day comes when you speak and the room freezes. You move, and the hierarchy adjusts around you. You assume command, and nobody dares ask for your credentials because they do not see a pretender mimicking strength. They witness a man hardened in the fires of silence. True deference is never demanded, requested, or begged for. It is engineered. And Machiavelli possessed the blueprints. He grasped that the apex of respect, the variety that lingers long after you have left the building, the kind that suffocates a room before you even open your mouth, stems from one source: total domination over the things weak men dread. Weak men are allergic to discomfort. They are terrified of being misunderstood or disliked. They are petrified of standing isolated in the noise. But the Machiavellian archetype consumes this pressure. He does not flee from psychological tension. He accelerates into it. He does not crumble under the weight of judgment. He uses it as a whetstone to sharpen his resolve. When you murder the reflex to justify your existence, when you starve the hunger for applause, and when you amputate every fear-based impulse, you mutate into something unrecognizable to the average civilian, something unsettling, something untouchable. This is precisely why the herd begins to revere you. It is not because you increased your volume or feigned kindness. It is because you have become a black box revealing nothing, and that obscurity terrifies the human animal. It is hardwired biology. We fear what we cannot decipher. So when you enter a space needing to prove absolutely nothing, holding your frame while others twitch and fidget, and your silence weighs heavy on their chests, you flip the script. You stop chasing respect. You become the gravitational center that generates it. Watch closely, and you will notice a subtle transformation in the atmosphere when you enter a room. The cadence of conversation shifts. Voices drop an octave, and people begin to tread lightly, meticulously, weighing every syllable because they are terrified of revealing even a hint of fragility in your presence. Why does this happen? It is because you have conquered the one internal enemy they are still enslaved by. you have ruthlessly extinguished the desperate, pathetic need for external validation that drives the average person. You have strangled the inner voice that begs for applause and made a fortress of your own solitude. Consequently, your validation has shifted from a commodity that is given away freely to a rare asset that is almost impossible to acquire. And basic economics dictates that scarcity drives value. This brings us to the ultimate strategic principle, derived from high-level power dynamics. You must inflate the cost of your respect until it becomes a luxury good. Never hand it out like loose change. Do not offer cheap flattery to smooth over social friction, and never ever smile simply to be polite. Make every nod of approval something they have to bleed to earn. When they understand that you are immune to their superficial charm, unaffected by peer pressure, and unimpressed by popularity, a psychological shift occurs. They are forced to recalibrate their behavior to meet your exacting standards. Alternatively, they will crumble and fade away. In either scenario, you emerge victorious. You will either cultivate a circle of high-caliber allies who can operate at your level, or you will effortlessly filter out the parasites too weak to stand in your shadow. This is the essence of true dominion. We are not talking about the loud, brittle authority of a tyrant who screams to be heard, but the gravitational pull of a leader whose power is felt physically in the room. It creates a specific type of anxiety in others, prompting them to internally question, "Why does his silence unnerve me? Why am I suddenly desperate for his good opinion? What hidden truths does he perceive that I am blind to?" Do not mistake this for intimidation. This is the sheer weight of presence. It is constructed methodically by surgically removing every tic, every stutter, and every nervous habit that broadcasts insecurity to the world. Because once you have achieved this level of self-mastery, once you have stripped the fat from your language and purified your speech of all uncertain terms, once you have honed your silence into a weapon and calcified your identity into something unbreakable, you embody the archetype. The great strategists revered most a figure who does not simply request respect, but extracts it. He leaves them with absolutely no other option. This is not achieved through overt cruelty or terror, which are crude tools, but through a terrifyingly precise social calibration that others cannot comprehend. You transform into the yardstick by which they measure their own worth a flawless mirror that mercilessly reflects their deepest insecurities back at them without you saying a word. You become the living proof that true power never needs an introduction. So stand back and allow the weak to expose their nature. Let them fill the silence with nervous chatter. Let them dance for attention. Let them chase the fleeting comfort of group approval. Meanwhile, you continue to build your empire in total silence until they are paralyzed by the spectacle of your ascent, realizing they lost the war to a man who never even stepped onto their battlefield. This brings us to the ultimate conclusion of our study in power dynamics. You do not defeat weak men by engaging in conflict with them. You destroy them by demonstrating that they are entirely beneath your notice. That is the pinnacle of Machiavellian sovereignty.